Have you ever noticed how much time you spend inside yourself, inside your mind, talking to yourself about you, talking to yourself about what you should have done or should do, but also talking to other people, imagining a conversation that you want to have with that person, the conversation that's going to finally help you explain to someone else what's so important to you, what you would like them to understand about you. Or maybe it's a conversation about asking for forgiveness, about how you've learned to see through different eyes and you can recognize where the other person is, and you want them to know how you have had this change of heart. But the fascinating thing, the really fascinating thing is that when you finally sit down in front of any of those people, the conversation will never unfold that way. Because the person you imagine inside of yourself is your own creation. The person you're talking to isn't your daughter or your son or your husband or your wife or your lover or your girlfriend, boyfriend, someone at work, your employer, it isn't ever that person. That person in your head is your own construct. It's an imaginary world. And in so doing, actually not being present in our bodies, to our real feelings, to our actual sensations, to what's really happening right now, to what we see, what we hear, the world itself. The vast majority of the time, we're just simply churning story after story after story, conversation after conversation after conversation with people that we think are real, but are really just creations in our own mind. So if you can see this, just simply say, oh, I'm in an imaginary conversation. And in that second, let it go. Feel what happens in that second, in that moment in which there's been so much identification, so much of thinking invested in that imaginary conversation. And then your aware ego looks and sees, look at that I'm doing. I'm having an imaginary conversation. And in that split second, it drops. And you're in a moment, and usually it's only a moment before some other form of thinking comes in. For example, the narrator will come in and say, oh, look, I woke up to the fact that I was in an imaginary conversation and I stopped it. And so the narrator starts telling you, the commentator starts telling you what you did and how well you did it. And between the narrator, commentator, and this process of repeated conversations with people in our heads, I think for most of us, that's probably 90% of the ways in which we simply avoid being alive, awake, present, here and now. And so by pointing this out, I'm inviting you to trust that when it comes time to have a real conversation with someone, because you've stopped these imaginary conversations over and over again, you'll be in a better position to actually speak from your heart, and you'll be in a better position to hear this person when they speak to you. Because if you've dwelled so long on who they are and how they haven't been or how they should be and what you should say and what you shouldn't say, then you've constructed them in such a way that when they're actually in front of you, you won't see them and you really won't hear them. You'll filter them, and you'll filter what they say. You'll reinterpret what they say so quickly that the conversation is, in a sense, doomed to ever having real intimacy, real connectedness, and thinking that when a real conversation is happening, it will unfold. I'll be available to myself, to my feeling, to my heart. My body wisdom and my heart wisdom will be there, informing my words, and I'll be able to hear the other, see the other, sense the other, understand more of where he or she is coming from. So wake yourself up out of these imaginary conversations and all the commenting you make and narrating you make about these imaginary conversations. And take a taste again and again and again and again of clear-mindedness, Let's have people be real and not just imaginary constructs.
So I just want to tell a spooky story for Halloween. Uh, I usually post dance things on this channel, but this was just kind of a fun little story. Something I remembered, something I was watching on TV prompted memory, and I remembered this spooky story. So since it's near Halloween, I thought it would be a good time. So this might be the kind of story if you want to settle down before bedtime and listen to it. I'll keep it pretty short. It probably only won't be even 10 minutes long. So here's my story. As many of you know, I grew up in Maine, up near the woods where it was kind of, remote. My dad really liked living on the land and hunting and fishing and doing all those things. So where we lived, our house was set way back, like an eighth of a mile from the road, and it was a country road, and there wasn't a lot of development around that time. And my dad bought almost 20 acres of land. So our house was just surrounded by all of these woods, and we had a big garden, and there was just a lot of space. And so as a kid, I used to spend a lot of time in the woods. There were a lot of deer trails. There was one long deer trail because across the road from us was the Kennebec River. And quite often the deer would go through the woods next to our house. And there was this long deer trail where they used to go. They'd cross the road and then they'd go down to the river from there. So there was this big wide deer trail that was well traveled. We had a lot of deer. Sometimes we would look out back in our yard and see up to 20 deer. One time, even when I was little, we had a giant moose travel through our front yard. Like, we had this huge front yard, we had a giant pond. So the wildlife really liked our yard. I mean, they would just come right out. So, if you looked around, you'd always kind of look around to look for stuff. And what I used to love to do is, to go out into the woods and build a fort, or to just go for a walk in the woods. And I was never afraid of the woods, ever. I mean, I spent all my time out there from about age 6 or 7 on, until I was, I don't know, junior high age. I spent a lot of time in the woods, sometimes with friends, sometimes by myself, mostly by myself. And then I'd go to friends' houses and we'd wander around their part of the neighborhood. So we knew all the woods around us. I knew all the woods around the neighbors because I had neighbors on all sides of me that I would play with. So we knew the woods really, really well for at least probably a half a mile from our house and around on all sides. And there was this one giant tree that you could see. If you looked out our kitchen window, it stood higher than all the other trees. It was on a slight incline up the hill. And so by myself, I would go up the Jeep trail, which was basically a little road that was made from people using their cars going into the woods. And the Jeep trail would continue on toward all the way through to another road, actually, probably about a quarter mile or half a mile from our road. There was all this land in between, and my dad owned a big chunk of it. And so I would go off the Jeep trail onto a deer trail, which is a slightly smaller trail. And this was probably in the early fall, maybe when school had just started, or maybe just before school started. And I decided, because my mom was home on a Saturday, I told her, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to climb that big tree. So keep an eye out the kitchen window for me. So I went up and I decided to go off the trail and go over. There was this giant rock and then the tree, this giant tree. So I climbed up the tree. And it was a hard tree. I had to have been at least 10 at the time, because there were not a lot of low branches, so you really had to get high enough up to get to the bigger branches to get up into the tree. So I must have been at least 10 years old to be able to do that. And I got in the tree and I was climbing up the tree, and then suddenly this feeling came over me. I felt out of nowhere, I just felt like I was being watched. I felt like somebody was there. I felt like I didn't hear anything. I can't explain where the feeling came from. I had spent years and years in the woods and never felt this way. Never really had a creepy feeling ever before. And suddenly I felt like somebody was there. And I remembered noticing that as I was going into the woods, I didn't hear birds singing. I didn't hear, the usual wood sounds. Um, it was kind of like a clearing area, like sort of an open area, but with trees all around it. And I just kind of noticed it was really quiet, and I was just aware of my own breathing, which normally when there's noise in the woods, you don't hear your own breathing. But I didn't think much about that. And then I'm up in this tree, and then suddenly I get this really strong feeling. And at that age, my mom had had the talk with me about strangers and all that kind of stuff. But usually when you're on private property, strangers don't come walking into other people's property without permission because, you will scare people if you do that. So people, your neighbors don't do that. They'll call you on the phone and say, hey, I'm going to go hunting or something, but it wasn't hunting season yet. And they would say, hey, can I walk through or whatever? But I just had this, and I thought to myself, if there's somebody out here, I'm all alone. I don't know what I would do. So I got kind of spooked. And like I said, I'd been in the woods so much growing up. I never had been spooked before. So I just decided, you know what? I think I'm just going to go back to the house. So I came down out of the tree. I waved so that my mom could see me if she happened to be looking out the window at that point. And I was like, I just want to go home now. So I got out of the tree, and then I walked through the short trail. I looked around. I didn't see anybody. I didn't hear anything. I just had this horrible feeling. So I don't know what that was. And I thought, oh, I'm just scaring myself, whatever. So I walked back to the Jeep trail, and I'm starting to walk. There's, woods on both sides of it. And on the left side, I could hear something in the leaves. So it must have been fall because some leaves were on the ground. I could hear kind of rustling in the leaves. As I'm walking, I hear this rustling. And so I stopped. And then the rustling in the leaves stopped. And then I started walking again. And then I heard the rustling in the leaves again. And then I stopped again, and then the leaves stopped. And I was just like, what? Something is stopping when I stop, but it's making a lot of noise. It was almost like whatever was in the woods may have been watching me and then sort of escorting me out just to make sure that I left. Maybe there was a wild animal that was like hunting for the deer, and I just happened to walk in at the wrong time, and it just kind of wanted me to leave. I don't know. And so I keep walking down the Jeep trail. At this point, I'm really spooked because clearly there's something in the woods. It didn't sound, I thought maybe it's just a squirrel, but it was making a lot of noise for a squirrel. So at that point, I just bolted back to the house, and I just ran as fast as I could and got back into our yard. And I probably didn't slow down until I had gone past the tool shed and literally just went right in the front door. And after that, I was probably almost entering into junior high or whatever. I must have been in 5th or 6th grade or something. I was like, all right, I think I'm not climbing trees anymore in the woods, and I think I probably won't go out there alone. And I really didn't want to go out in the woods anymore. I can't explain why. I guess I just sort of outgrew wanting to be in the woods. And this kind of sense of that, feeling vulnerable, I think, generally. So that's my spooky story. Maybe, I convinced myself that I just kind of scared myself, but that, I just had this horrible feeling come over me, and just hearing something in the woods that was stopping when I stopped, and then walking when I walked, kind of, paralleling me in the woods down the Jeep trail. That was enough for me to not spend much more time in the woods. I've never been much of an outdoor person anyway, but that's my spooky story. So happy Halloween, and I hope you enjoyed it. And look for my spooky Halloween dance, which is done to a sort of scary sounding music, funky, and I did some special effects with editing, which I'm learning to do. So check out my Halloween dance, and I will see you again soon, hopefully. Take care.